Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, ERB Laws, and this is my co host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent episodes. We gained a handful of subs recently, and you guys really seem to like the vlog we put out. So thank you for running that all the way up. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for updates and more content. Um, and yeah, so looking a little bit into today and probably for the nearby future, the summer league has pretty much died down. So most of the first round guys who played have been shut down. So we won't be covering, that too much unless something major happens or, there's like a huge breakout performance, something along those lines.
It's Ben Sacker scoring 40 points.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, and then what else was I gonna have in there? Yeah, so we'll also be updating you guys on, more trade rumors such as like Lillard, Harden, the big name guys, and obviously, in the rumors and news stuff, we'll be covering some of the minor guys as well. But yeah, so to pivot into like the content that we're going to be focusing on, um, you know, right now and in the future, like I said, we're going to be, focusing on teams specifically per episode. So, that would be like what their plans are, how we got to this point for them, and what their realistic goals should be going into the next season and for more seasons to come. So, if you want to go ahead and reveal what our first team is going to be, you ready for that?
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
I guess we'll kick it off kind of with the team that made a ton of moves this offseason, or,
Hmm.
one of the biggest moves, and that's the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah.
So, obviously, we know what happened with them over the last few years, right? Initially for a while, they were, kind of a team in the midst of a rebuild, right? Led by Devin Booker. Then eventually DeAndre Ayton comes into the fray, right? Then eventually they trade for Chris Paul. Monty Williams is also there as well, and they have a crazy run where they get to the NBA Finals, losing six to the Milwaukee Bucks, right? But a lot of people were kind of low on them for some certain reasons because a
Sure.
lot of people felt that their path to the finals was largely mainly due to the fact that they played a lot of teams that went down due to injuries, right? Such as say the Lakers, the Nuggets, the Clippers, right? So then obviously the next season, right, was kind of similar to what happened with Golden State in 2015, except Golden State won the title, right? Sort of like we're going to prove you guys wrong type of season, right?
Right.
So they ended up winning 64 games, right? Best team in the NBA record wise. A lot of people feel like they're the prohibitive favorites, or if not prohibitive, right? A lot of people thought that they were definitely the favorites to win the title.
Absolutely.
Um, and then obviously, they go into the first round, beat the Pelicans in six, but the series went on longer than expected. And in fairness, Devin Booker got hurt. Then they have the second round where they play against the Dallas Mavericks, go up 2-0, and then they lose in game seven in pretty embarrassing fashion where the game's basically over at halftime,
Yeah.
right? So then, they basically go into next season, right, with largely a similar roster aside from a few changes, right? They're going into that season, right? Some of the guys are gone, like say JaVale McGee, right? He's moved out, and they just bring in a few other guys, right? But it's largely the same basic roster, right?
Sure.
Um, but obviously, we know in that offseason there were a lot of rumors because Kevin Durant was, rumored to be interested in going there once he requested a trade, and eventually he made his way there, right? And then obviously we know the rest, right? He's hurt. He comes in. They go undefeated in the regular season games that he plays, and then they go into the playoffs, beat the Clippers in five, and then get eliminated by the Suns in six,
Yeah.
or excuse me, by the Nuggets in six, basically in the same fashion.
Sure.
So now that we go into this offseason, and they end up making kind of a surprising shocker trade for Bradley Beal, right? We knew Bradley Beal wanted out, but initially the Suns weren't really looked at as the team to get him, right? People thought it was the Heat. Maybe Milwaukee had an outside chance, um, but they end up getting him. So now their team is kind of, at least for now, built around, three stars and then a fourth guy in Aiton who's kind of in that next tier, right? Where he's a good player, but not consistent enough to be a star.
Sure.
Although again, very talented. They obviously also fired Monty Williams and brought in Frank Vogel as their head coach. Um, so right now we're kind of just like, looking into the roster, I guess we know, Beal, Book, Durant, Aiton, right? Those are their four main starters. Reportedly they're going to run Bradley Beal at point guard, which is kind of what I assumed. I didn't really expect them to run Devin Booker at small forward. I know Beal's not a natural point guard. He's,
Right.
obviously more of a, not even really a combo guard. I think he's just a shooting guard. I
Can
know
I
he can, make somewhat, but, I
can I
don't really
speak
look
on
at him as
that?
really. Yeah, sure, go on.
As a Wizards fan, clearly, that's why I have the hat on. Beal at the point guard is a disaster class. Um, and that's not to say that he's bad at all. I think he's a really good player. But him at the one, he's not a natural point guard. He didn't grow up playing the one. He's definitely more of a two, like you said, scoring guard. There's plays and sets where he can run the one flawlessly, but for the majority of a game, you don't want him running the one. He's a very turnover prone person. Um, and that's kind of just how I look at it. And when he ran the one for the Wizards at times, it didn't look like he knew what he was really doing, if you want me to be honest. But that could be, poor coaching, poor sets, poor offense, whatever the case may be, poor personnel. So it may look better, with him running the one alongside Kevin Durant and D Book. But I mean, I would prefer Devin Booker at the one. I think we've seen him run the one pretty well. I think he's a better passer, definitely a better playmaker. But I just wanted to interject there for a second, just due to the fact that I've watched Beal at point guard, and maybe a lot of people haven't seen that, but it's a nightmare in my opinion.
Right, exactly. So, for now, obviously, the roster can change. Maybe they trade Ayton later on in the season, or maybe
Hmm.
they just keep the same roster. But for now, we know those are your main four starters. So the next person would be the fifth one,
Hmm.
right? And that's kind of where, you kind of wonder who it's going to be, right? Last year, I think for a while it was, either Josh Chakotay, I think, or Torrey Craig at different points. But,
It's
obviously
both of them.
Craig, he's gone. I believe he went to Chicago.
Yeah,
So, I'm going to assume for now that it's probably still going to be a Kogi. I mean, I'm sure that position will be up for grabs,
sure.
but obviously the question there is you got to have somebody that can do, the other things, that the other guys aren't really going to do in the roster, right? So my guess, like I said, is a Kogi, just because he already started for them. He gives you some athleticism, he gives you some defense.
Hmm.
Um, but he is a guy that, because he's on a minimum contract, obviously there's no guarantee. So it could be somebody else, right? It could be Kata Bates Jop. It could be Wainwright. Maybe they move Durant to the three and have somebody else at the four.
Hmm.
Even though at this point Durant's probably just more of a four at this point, not
Yeah,
really a three. Um, so you have some questions there, right? But I feel like for now that's pretty much the starting five. And then you look at the bench, right? Jordan Goodwin, I believe he's the other guy that kind of came over from the
yep,
Wizards, and he's expected to be probably their backup point guard.
that's what I'm
Um,
thinking.
yeah, at least as far as the regular season goes, right? Saban Lee, probably third stringer. Right. Then you go back to the shooting guard spot, right? Eric Gordon, I'm going to assume he's gonna be, the backup two guard behind
Yep.
Devin Booker instead of Damian Lee. Right, and then behind Akogi, again, you have your other forwards, right? Wainwright, Jop, Wainwright and Kata Bates Jop, two
Yeah.
different guys. Then Durant, right? Bol, who played a lot of four in Orlando. Maybe he plays five. I don't know. We'll see. And then Yuta Watanabe, right, who they also grabbed over from Brooklyn, right,
Hmm.
former teammate Kevin Durant. And then behind Ayton, you got Devin Eubanks and Chemezi Metu. So pretty much they have 15 guys. Um, so their roster is pretty much set in terms of them not really bringing in anybody, other than a potential trade.
Sure.
So,
And they already made one.
obviously,
I know they got rid of
yeah,
campaign, I think, right?
yeah, exactly. I was going to say,
Yeah, sorry.
I forgot to mention Cameron Payne. They traded as of this recording
Hmm.
today. Obviously, you'll be watching it the next day, but regardless, yeah, they traded him to the Spurs. Didn't bring back any players. I believe they traded Payne and a second for a second,
Yeah.
so they didn't get anybody back. And I think they used that to free up the roster spot to sign Bol,
Yes.
which we kind of talked about in a way. I think in one of the previous podcasts when it was initially rumored that Bol was gonna probably sign with the Suns, where we were
Hmm.
like, okay, probably means that somebody is either getting moved or cut.
Right.
And that's what they ended up doing with campaign, and that's fine because again, you don't really have to have him, on the roster. I mean, it would be nice if you could, there was a rumor about them maybe acquiring T.J. McConnell, right, and swapping campaign, but I guess that just didn't work out. I guess I'd personally prefer that than just having no backup point guard. But, either way, you just never know how those trades work. But, for now, when we look at their strengths, we know what the strengths are, right? Obviously, offense, right? They're going to be able to get and create whatever shot they want, right? You got multiple guys that can score off the dribble in a variety of different ways, right? Ball handling, obviously, you got in addition to, obviously just being able to score, those guys can dribble, right? Like I said, they can create shots three levels, right? In the paint, mid range, 3-point line.
Yeah.
Um, this isn't necessarily a strength of theirs, but they are a little bigger than you would think. I mean, Durant, is 7 feet tall. He's
Yep.
obviously not a guy you want guarding centers, right? But Aiton's a big guy. Booker's got decent amount of size for a two guard. Um, you got a few other bigs off the bench, right? But I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if I would call it a strength of theirs, but they're not like a puny team. They do
I
have
get you.
some guys that are smaller. Right. But then, when you move Beal like to point guard, then he's not quite as small as he would be if he was just playing at the two.
Sure.
Um, so size wise, it's not too bad. But you would like to have probably another traditional center. Obviously, Bol gives you some more length, but who knows with him? He's kind of a guy, who so far hasn't panned out. But
Yeah, he's up and down.
that's what yeah, but that's what I see with the strengths. Obviously you can kind of get into your, thoughts of the roster in terms of like the depth chart and the
Sure.
strengths as well before we get into the weaknesses, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, we all know the star power is there. They're all going to be the starters. KD, Beal, Booker, and Aiton. They're going to take the majority of the minutes per night. I think that's a given. It's those are 4 out of their 5 starters for sure. Um, and now it's like I'm just interested because I feel like ever since their owner has taken over, they've been making move after move. It's been like nonstop. Even in free agency, they made a plethora of moves, which we were pretty happy about to see them bolster up their roster. Because when initially we were like, okay, you got Beal, but now your roster's kind of thin. But I like the roster as of right now. And with Chris Paul gone, I don't think they necessarily have that traditional point guard to handle those kind of duties. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of the whole Beal thing. Um, but I really thought Booker was going to take that over. But they have an array of ball handlers. I think that's a huge strength that they have as well. Because now you've got Beal, you've got Goodwin, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, Eric Gordon, and I guess what Saban Lee. I mean, those are all pretty good ball handlers in my opinion. So I think that's definitely a strength of theirs. I think the shot creation is going to be there. The spacing is going to be amazing. But will it be enough to get to the finals? Because I'm not sure if they have what it takes in terms of um, the longevity of things because I feel like, Booker has had a huge injury this season or last season, I should say. Beal has been known to miss some time, and now Kevin Durant as well. So I'm curious to see how that's going to affect their regular season. But come postseason, will they be ready and be able to step up to the plate? I'm not too sure. But overall, I do like the roster. So no complaints on that except for probably that point guard spot. But nonetheless, I feel like, getting rid of campaign to bring in Bol I think is a great move because I think they'll be saving around what, like $30 million, I think, in tax savings for Phoenix by
Something.
trading him. So, by trading him, you do get some sort of value back. And then you also get, Bol who's at this point, he's not lived up to what he was supposed to be, but at the same time, he's still a decent enough player to the point where I think Bol can bring a little bit more to the table than Cameron Payne at this point. So, like I said, I'm not super mad about anything except for maybe the point guard spot. Um, but
Yeah.
I think, at this point, we talked about it multiple times too. Um, it's championship or bust for them. I think that's the narrative here because they're going all in on these win now moves. And when you do that, you're putting that label of we're trying to win now. So if you don't win now, that tells me that, you don't have what it takes at this point. So and there's not much they can really add to the roster because they've got so many guys making so much money. That's a huge concern. Even though that scoring potential and offense is definitely there. Um, I'm just curious to see how the roster is going to work going into the future. Say they don't win the championship this year.
Right. Yeah, because the Bol thing. Yeah, like you said, so far he hasn't really panned out.
Mm-hmm.
As a legitimate, consistent NBA guy.
Right.
Had that stretch early last year where he looked relatively solid. And in fairness, the Orlando roster because they had so many big guys, was just kind of weird.
Right.
I just kind of look at it sort of like what some of these other teams did. Kind of like what LA did with Malik Monk a few years ago, and what they're doing this year with like Cam Reddish and Jackson Hayes,
Sure.
where it's like you're just taking a flyer on a young guy. It's just a minimum contract, so if it works out and he ends up being really solid, right, then that's a plus because that gives you another guy you could potentially just put out there, that can maybe help you win some games if he pops, right, and if he doesn't, well, it's a minimum contract, so it's not going to really hurt you.
Sure.
Obviously, just you don't have the flexibility necessarily to do a whole lot if it doesn't work. But yeah, we already mentioned the strengths. Like I said, weaknesses for me, like you said, the lack of a real point guard, I think, is kind of a problem because we've
Mm-hmm.
seen with a lot of these teams in the playoffs, that's been a real issue, right? Even with a team like, say, Boston, right, where they have the great options at the wing, but not really like a, great option as like your, typical point guard, right? Where it just felt like at times the offense just would kind of bog down for Boston and just get a little bit too, simplified to the point where it was just very predictable.
Yes.
Um, and like we saw other teams like that, even like the Clippers. I think the first year they were together, right, where they had the problems against Denver when they lost 3-1 lead, where they just, they just didn't know how to close out those games.
Sure.
So that's definitely a concern that you have there, because like you said, Beal's not a natural point guard. Booker's played a lot more point guard now, so you would think he'd be more comfortable with it. Even though again, he's still naturally a scorer, right? So he's not really, looked at as, in terms of running the offense like a point guard. But it is kind of interesting because you would think like, that it would be Booker, but it could just also be a name only, right? Because like size wise, Beal would be more like, a point guard guarding other point guards. But even though defense isn't really his thing,
Yeah.
um, that kind of leads me, to the other concern is the defense, where they did get some good guys, for the minimum, but I'm still like skeptical about how many guys on this roster are guys where you know, every night, right? They're gonna go out there and defend their butts off. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Like,
I get you.
that they have guys that can play defense, right?
They
Like
have
Durant
willing
can.
defenders.
Yeah, they have guys like Durant who can play defense, right? Booker can play defense. Um, obviously Aiton at times, sometimes, can play some defense
Yeah.
because of his size. But you don't really have a lot of guys on the roster where it's like that's their biggest strength. That's what they do, right? Or even like dirty work guys. You just don't have a lot of those type of guys. It's, primarily a lot more offensive minded players. Um, kind of I guess similar to that Nets roster from a few years back. Where you had like Durant, Kyrie, and Harden.
Mhm.
Like Blake Griffin was the center, right?
Right.
So I mean, that's kind of how I look at it from there. Rebounding wise, I mean, again, Durant and Aiton, those are two tall guys, right? But again, you don't have a lot of like great rebounders, in my opinion, but you may still be able to get some just because of the size.
Right.
And then, like you mentioned, the durability is also a concern, just because you have a number of guys that typically miss a lot of time. Durant misses a lot of time. Beal misses a lot of time. So that would be my concern there, just in terms of those weaknesses. And like you said, also just the lack of flexibility, right? Like the roster's probably not going to be that much different, between now and the end of the season, because there's just what can they really do? The only thing you could potentially do is trade DeAndre Ayton,
Right.
which again you could do.
You could,
It's
but
just
what
a
are you gonna
matter of
get back for that though?
what
You
are
know?
you going to get back for
Yep.
him, and it's harder to to pull off those type of trades now when you're in that luxury tax tier, I think, because then the salaries basically have to match exactly, right? Like I think in the past they could be like sort of in a range of each other, but I think now they sort of have to almost basically be exact. So
Sure.
that makes it a lot harder as well.
Yeah.
Just because you have to find players that basically add up to his salary, which again is possible, but we'll have to see how that works out.
Yeah.
Like you said, they're definitely championship or bust, right? They're in that tier because like for me, I kind of have like different tiers of teams where it's, in my opinion, it's like okay, if you were to get eliminated in this round, right,
Mhm.
would it be a disappointment, right?
Okay.
Like there are some teams where like if they get eliminated in the first round, it's not really a disappointment, right?
Sure.
If they get eliminated in the second round, it's not a disappointment. For Phoenix, it's championship or bust, right? Like basically, if they have a season similar to the last couple of seasons that they've had, that's a failure, right?
I agree.
Like it needs yeah, it basically needs to be championship or bust. They need to at least, I think, get to the conference finals, if not win the whole thing.
Yeah.
Just because I know like it's not always, a guarantee to make the
Right.
NBA
And
finals. But
injuries and all that stuff.
yeah.
Um,
But you at least gotta do better than the last couple of seasons, just
absolutely.
because again, you have a roster now where you have, a superstar. You have another guy in Booker who, even if he's not a superstar, if you don't think that, it's certainly in that tier of, you know, he, on any given night, he can look like a top, flight player, right?
Sure.
You have Bradley Beal, right? Who now he's, kind of the third guy, right? Maybe you could argue overqualified third guy, or maybe his, ultimate destiny is kind of like as a third guy.
Mhm.
Regardless, you have three really talented players. Um, Another guy who's the fourth guy who's a pretty solid player, right? Just a little bit, up and down. And you got guys that are, better than your typical minimum contract signing. So you have, in theory, you should have the talent, right, to be a championship caliber team. Do they have the makeup of a championship team in terms of do they have all the ingredients? I don't necessarily know about that,
Right.
but either way, talent wise, they should be good enough to at least get to the conference finals.
I agree.
But either way, right, they're not measured by what they do in the regular season. It's about what they do come playoff time. They
Postseason, yes,
could win,
sir.
65, 70 games in the regular season, and it wouldn't matter if they don't end up, making it to the finals and winning the title. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where I look at it there, right? Like I don't think they'll win the title, but they should be good enough that like they should at least be in the mix, in my opinion, just because they have so much talent
Yeah,
at the
I
top.
agree.
But it's ultimately going to be a test of once again, right? Like how far can you go in terms of like this type of offensive talent, sacrificing defense in order to be like a championship team? Because we just haven't seen, at least from what I can remember, we just haven't seen like a team, that's primarily an offensive oriented team that doesn't really have the makings of like a really good defensive team
Sure.
um to win a title, right? Like even Denver last year, our concern was, can they defend in the playoffs? And they actually were able to. But then even if you look at their roster, you can at least make the case, well, they do have some really good defenders, right? Guys that like that's a big part of what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Caldwell Pope, Eric
Mm-hmm.
Gordon, Brown last year for them, right? Phoenix just doesn't have those type of guys.
Sure.
Um, and maybe they can find a way to get one of those guys, maybe at the deadline. Frank Vogel, obviously he's a defensive minded coach, but again, I saw him, coach the Lakers team with Westbrook, where, the thought process was, oh, he's a defensive minded coach, so we don't need to sign any real defensive players. He can figure it out. And they didn't figure it out. It didn't work at all. Now the guys that Phoenix got on the minimum are, better, right? Like, I mean, Drew Eubanks is better than DeAndre Jordan.
Sure.
Um,
I agree.
but yeah, but either way, I just I need to see how they're gonna defend because I
Sure.
still think you have to at least have a baseline level of being a really good defensive team before you can win a title. And again, maybe they're the first team to ever do it. Because again, we've seen a lot of historical trends bucked over the last few years, but I still think you need to at least be a really good defensive team. But either way, I still think they'll be really good,
Okay.
right?
I
Yeah,
can, yeah,
as long
I
as
get
they're
that.
healthy.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. They seem to be very confident. That's kind of the trend that I've
Yeah.
been noticing. A lot of these guys are confident. They're excited to play together. It's really cool because we haven't really seen a trio like this in terms of offensive star power. They have arguably three of the, you know, top scorers in the game right now. And the owner even said, we're going to win at everything we do. Like that's a pretty bold statement. And then, even Kevin Durant on Twitter he said offense wins championships. So like, um, I mean, I'm just gonna ask you a point blank question, and then we can kind of break down his tweet. So, do you think they have what it takes to really win this thing, or are we kind of in the position where we kind of have to wait and see? Because me, I think they can win it. Um, so I'm gonna put like all my chips on the table and say they're probably gonna win the championship. But like, do you think they can do this year, or or is there like where do you
I
stand
think
on it is basically what I'm asking.
I think that they can win the championship because of the
Okay.
talent. I just don't think they will because I just feel like I just don't believe that they're going to be able to defend at a high enough level, despite the offensive firepower. But I could be wrong because again, like the Nets, you could argue they were on the trajectory to win that title. I guess it was what at this point 2-3 seasons ago.
Are you talking about when
If
Durant and Kyrie and Harden?
yeah, yeah, if
Okay, yeah.
not for the injuries, because they were right there, and then they
Yeah.
had the injury, so you can make the argument, that for them they could have won it all. But then you still have to factor in the injuries when you don't have that deep of a roster. So I think talent wise, they should be able to win the title, but I
Mhm.
just don't feel like they will, just because I just don't. I think you got to at least defend at a certain level. Because again, even with Denver, we saw them defend, way better than we expected. Because again, they weren't either of our picks, to make the finals,
Sure.
going into the playoffs, but they actually ended up being better defensively than expected. And again, but in fairness to them, they did have a number of guys that identify as like defensive players, right? Like
Right.
I mentioned Caldwell Pope, Aaron Gordon, Bruce Brown. I just don't think the Suns have those type of players. And maybe they don't have to have those type of players just because of their offense, but I just feel like we got to wait and see come playoff time. Because like I said, I know they're going to be good in the regular season as long as they're healthy. Like,
Yeah.
unless something goes horribly wrong, they
Right,
should
right.
be a really good regular season team. I just got to wait and see what it looks like come playoff time before I crown them
Okay.
title because I didn't crown them as I didn't think they were coming out of the West last year
No, you
just because
didn't.
I just felt like because my issue was I didn't feel like they had enough depth or defense and both of those things were kind of the reasons why they got eliminated last year because they did once Chris Paul got hurt they didn't have enough guys and they
Yeah.
didn't have enough guys to defend Denver's offense. So I
Right.
just got to kind of wait and see. But I'm not going to completely rule it out because again, like I do think Brooklyn had a chance to win the title a few seasons ago, if not for the injuries. And every year injuries always happens that kind of muck something up, right?
Yeah.
Giannis got hurt this year in
Yep.
the playoffs. And again, they were our pick to get to the finals and win the championship, right? So I mean, you know, so I'm open to the idea of it happening. I just don't feel like it will happen. But
Okay.
again, would it shock me if they're really good and they at least get to the conference finals? No, because I think they should. I think
Yeah.
they have too much talent to go out the way they did the last couple. I just don't think they're going to win the title.
Sure. And I feel like it's a thought-provoking tweet that Durant put out, with the whole offense wins championships because he's basically talking about his own team, like you said, Phoenix, they don't have any players that scream, defensive-minded guards, big men, or anything like that. So that's kind of
Yeah,
interesting if you take a look
if
at their
that are
roster.
good defenders, but not
Sure.
necessarily anybody I would say like that's an elite defender. I think you got
Exactly.
to at least have one of those guys, preferably more than one, to win the title.
Yeah, and like historically, like what? Like, majority of the NBA champions have been, a top 10 defense. I feel like, even like teams that have gotten to the finals, most of them have been like top 10 defenses for that season or whatever. Um,
Right.
but as of recently, it hasn't been, the best defensive teams winning these championships for sure. So I feel like we're
Yeah.
kind of departing from that trend. Maybe the modern NBA is
Yeah.
turning into something else, and we're
Yeah.
just gonna kind of have to sit back and watch.
Yeah. Because
um but
if you go
yeah,
back,
I don't know, it's interesting to me.
yeah, because if you go back the year before, right, it was the Warriors and the Celtics, and both of those teams were top five defensive teams,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken. I think they were like 1 and 2
Right.
basically, at least in the playoffs. The year before, right, the Suns and the Bucks, they were pretty good defensive teams. Obviously the Lakers were definitely a really good defensive team the year they won the title, right? The Warriors with Kevin Durant, they were a really good defensive
Yeah,
team.
and I was just saying,
Um,
like, teams that like even just got there, they may not have been like top 10 defensive
right.
ones.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think the Heat, when they played against the Lakers in the finals, in the playoffs, they were better, defensively than they were in the regular season. Because I think in the
Right.
regular season they were like a 5 seed, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken, or something like that. And that's kind of the other factor is that we've seen especially come playoff time, we've seen some of these teams that had like kind of regular seasons where they're not quite as good, and then in
Mhm.
the playoffs, all of a sudden, they go much further than expected, right?
Sure.
Like, the Lakers were the 7th seed and they got to the conference finals. The Heat in the bubble, they were the 5th seed and they got to the NBA finals. Um, and even some of these other teams, right? Like the Miami Heat, they were the 8th seed this year and they got to the NBA finals. So, like there's a pathway. It just to me, it depends on what level of defense it is. But you could also make the argument that their defensive ceiling doesn't have to be as high,
Sure.
just because we're assuming that their offense is going to be, even with their floor, it should be like a top three offensive team.
Yeah.
Just because of the firepower you have, and then outside of those three guys, all anyone else has to do is just be able to hit open shots.
Yeah.
So
And like my thing is like, even, let's look at Denver, right? I think they were ranked what, like maybe 15th in overall defensive rating, I think
yeah,
during the
and
season
then
or last season.
come playoff time, they were like top five.
Yeah, exactly. But like they showcased that unstoppable offense, and they like pretty much overwhelmed every single opponent that they had. Um, but like it's so cool to see because now we're looking at it and it's like, there's multiple routes. There's not just one route to take
Yeah,
to get to the finals and even win the finals, because they had individual, performances where they were monster games, but they also had exceptional teamwork. So, and
yeah,
they defied the expectations because everybody put that question mark on Denver's heads because they didn't know come playoff time if Jokic was going to be able to perform the same way or if his supporting cast was even going to show up to the show pretty much. Um, but I feel like they showed that offensive firepower can definitely be a key to winning the championship,
yeah,
and I feel like that may be like a testament to the evolving nature of the game somewhat. So I don't know. It's like I feel like defense definitely remains crucial for sure. But I don't think it's like the only determining factor in like a team's
no,
championship success
I
or
don't think it
anything
ever
like that.
was.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
like, the league's rule changes and all that stuff, it's favoring offense and increased scoring opportunities. So I think that's a big deal. And even like JJ Redick on his podcast, I think it's called The Old Man and the Three, I think is what it's
yeah,
called.
yeah.
Sorry if I messed that up, but yeah, he was
That's
like,
it.
this is a really good quote. I think, he said the adage maybe had some truth to it, at least a kernel of truth in prior generations of the NBA. I think the reality is right now you either need superhuman performances from your top players or you need an unstoppable offense to really win a championship. So I think there's some truth to what Katie had to say in terms of offense wins championships. And like that's what I'm saying. Like I feel like this team can really do something special because like I said, we haven't really seen a lot of guys put up the same numbers that these guys have put up career-wise on the same squad. These are players that can easily explode for 30 a night, given they can actually hit their shots. So I'm very curious to see, say they all, have a great night. I'm curious to see what that box score is going to look like offensively. And if that's going to even be able to somewhat negate their defensive woes that I'm sure they're going to have. So I don't know. It's very interesting. And I'm curious to see if this maybe even sets like the modern day meta of the NBA that we'll be seeing going forward, or if it's just like a one-off thing and it just turns out to be a disaster. But I'm pretty
Right.
confident. I may be a little biased because I'm a huge KD fan, definitely a huge Beal fan. I'm not a huge Booker fan, but I am a Booker fan for sure. So I'm very, very, very curious to see where this
Yeah.
goes.
And that's kind of the concern is that if it doesn't work,
Hmm.
right, then you're going to be in some real trouble because we obviously already know that, they don't have, any first round picks. They got some back in these last couple of trades that they made, but in terms of first round picks, they're not really going to have any more,
Yeah.
basically for the next, 50 years, I
They have no
suppose.
future. It's
Yeah.
bad.
So,
And we've said that
yeah.
multiple times. We don't like the fact that their future is like bleak in terms of say, it fails, but their present
Right.
is pretty bright cuz I mean, they have
Yeah.
some pretty good scorers and
Yeah.
players on that team.
Because basically now you're committing to, hey, we're gonna try to be a championship team for the next few seasons.
Mhm.
You know, you got to all you got to do is get one.
I
Because
know.
once you get one, then it validates the trade that you ended up making.
Yep.
Obviously, it's gonna hurt, in the long run, right? But all you got to do is get one. You know what I mean? Because it's like, um, because at the time when the Lakers made that AD trade, right, there were a
Mhm.
lot of people who thought that the Lakers gave up too much
Sure. They
when
broke
it
up the young
happened.
core.
Yeah. And then, the first year they're together, they won the championship. So it's like, even if they never win another one, right? You got one in the first year you were together, and that validates putting that trade together. Um, in my opinion, because again, like that's the goal is to win championships. So if once you get one, then it's worth it. So that's the thing for Phoenix is they have to win a championship within I think the next probably 2 seasons. Just because once you start getting to like 3, 4, right, then you're starting to get into like Durant being like 37, 38, 39. And that's just when, you're just gonna be kind of concerned, as to what the ceiling of that team is gonna be, as
Sure.
Durant ages. Ability wise, he should age relatively well.
I think
It's just
so.
obviously because he's continued to have more and more injuries, is that going to get better over time? Probably not. So to me, I think this has got to be like basically a 2, 3 year window where you over these next 2, 3 years you need to win at least one championship because
Yeah.
I don't think it's realistic to assume that you could win three in a row or even back to back, right? Because we've seen like with a lot of these teams, back to back is hard, let alone three in a row, right? Because the Warriors won back to back with Durant, and then the third year they had injuries, so then they couldn't win three in a row. They would have if they had been healthy, um, but they weren't able to. So with the moves that they've made now, yeah, this is obviously a championship for bust team, and you got again a relatively small window because again, just given some of the guys on your team, obviously Booker and Aiton are young, right? Beal's now approaching 30. With a lot of injuries under him, and Durant is obviously what 35 or
Mhm.
however old he is at this point. So you got a short window, but talent wise, this should be one of the best teams um, that should be competing for the championship. I don't think there's any like
Yeah,
surprises
yeah,
or
yeah.
shocks.
And the West is getting stronger too. That's another
Yeah,
thing. Like, it's stronger than the East by far.
and it could
So,
get stronger. Potentially depending on what happens. With these trades. If
yeah.
anything has occurred, obviously nothing's happened as of late. but let's say if Harden gets traded to the Clippers, right? You would think, assuming that they don't give up, everything to get him,
Right, right,
right?
right.
You would think, the Clippers would still be a relatively competitive roster. And even like the teams that aren't going to be in the championship mix, they're not going to be teams that are like easy wins, right? Like
Right.
say like a team like Houston,
Hmm.
or somebody like that, those teams that are at the bottom, right? Those are like that's
Okay,
not going to
see?
be like yeah, Oklahoma City. Yeah, that's not those are not guaranteed wins anymore, right? Because like say like 5 years ago, you had a handful of teams where like you could basically just kind of just get up out of bed, and kind of just blow that team out of the water. Obviously, on any given night, an NBA team can beat anybody.
Sure.
I'm just saying that like the probability of just going in and beating even the worst teams is no longer as high because there's more talent.
Yeah.
Even with the Spurs, right? They're probably not going to be that good this year, but
They're
they're
not going to
definitely
be
going to be.
15th.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they're definitely going to be competitive every night, just because again, you got a guy that's 7.5 feet tall on the roster. So
Right.
I mean, just in general, that's the other thing because in the Western Conference, it's obviously the better conference. Even if Lillard goes to the Heat, right, the West is still probably going to be the more competitive conference just because of the quality of the teams, from top to bottom, basically. And that's the other tough part for the Suns is again, you got to basically get out of, three really tough opponents. Because say in the East, your first round matchup is probably going to be, I don't want to necessarily say a complete cakewalk,
Pretty
but it's going to
much,
be
though.
yeah, but it's gonna be easier than your first round matchup in the West, right? Like, I
Right.
mean, that's just that's just gonna that because think about it, right? Like in these playoffs this past season, right? Like in the East, right? I think Boston was the 2 seed, right? Their
Hmm.
seventh, their first round opponent was the Hawks,
Yep.
right? And now the Hawks gave them a scare, right? It went six, but I don't think anybody thought they were going to lose to Atlanta.
Right.
Um, but say Memphis, right on the other side of the bracket, they're the 2 seed, and guess what? Their reward for being the 2 seed is oh goody, you have to face LeBron and AD in the first round as the 7 seed,
Yeah.
with a new team. So that's kind of the other factor as well is it's once we get to the playoffs it'll be interesting who's seated where because there's is the potential for a team for them to face in the first round that's not going to be an easy matchup, right? What if say a team like Dallas who's made some improvements, what if they kind of sneak back in as a 7 seed, or say like a team like New Orleans kind of sneaks in
Yeah.
for one of those final playoff spots, that can get really interesting. Not that they're going to go out in the first round, but it's certainly going to be it's gonna be a dog fight,
Yeah, and I feel like
for
the
sure.
Grizzlies will be one to watch too.
Yeah,
Um, even like
because you wonder if they
the
maybe take.
Warriors.
Yeah, because you wonder if the Grizzlies, regular season standings wise, are they going to be the 2 seed again?
Right.
They've been able to win a lot of games without Ja, but the roster's still going to be a little bit different, right? No more Dylan Brooks. In comes Marcus Smart. Derrick Rose is now like a backup point guard. I don't know how much he'll play, right?
Right.
But their roster's a little bit different. Um, and obviously they have the injury to Brandon Clark, right? So your small ball lineups are going to be different as well.
Hmm.
But then obviously you could also factor in, what if their young guys, take another leap forward, right? Say, what if Desmond Bain and Jared Jackson Jr. get better? Then that could be a factor. And then look at Sacramento, right? They were a team that was the 3 seed last year,
Yep.
but are they going to be the 3 seed again?
Right.
I don't know. They may drop to like 6, 7, and all of a sudden they're playing Phoenix in the first
Right.
round. So
Can't forget the Lakers either, because they're
yeah,
pretty
exactly.
good defensively. So I'm curious to see how that will match up against Phoenix in the
Yeah,
regular season. So I feel like there's
it's
a
yeah,
lot going on in terms of, especially the West. I think the West is way more exciting in terms of looking forward for sure. It's a little bit more competitive. I feel like the East is still definitely up in the air, but yeah, I think Phoenix. I think they have the best chance in the West to win the title. I'm not going to count out Denver at all, but I'm putting, all my chips on the table for Phoenix, like I said, just due to the fact that this lineup is insane. And they seem really confident about their offense. And my main concern is probably the and coaching and the Beal point guard situation. I think, but I feel like the Beal point guard situation is a fixable thing. That could be a trial and error thing. Say it doesn't work out for however many
mhm.
games they want to test run it or whatever, then they just switch it up and they'll figure it out again. So, and like I
What's
said,
your
and like you said, regular season doesn't really matter. It's the postseason that
yeah?
counts.
What's your concern about the coaching related to?
Like you said, it's a defensive oriented coach.
Yeah,
Um, that's already a non-starter for me because I don't really want a defensive minded coach. coaching a offensively loaded squad. I mean, I guess I understand the logic because then it kind of evens out where it's like, okay, the offense will fall on the players, but the defense falls on the coach and the schemes. He's got to make that work because he's a defensive minded coach. So I understand the logic behind it, but I would prefer to just put, two and two together and just, have evens and match up the puzzle completely where it's like, okay, we can have, offensive minded coach and a great offense, like a Mike D'Antoni kind of deal where we're just
Yeah.
scoring, every single time. And it doesn't matter how many points teams drop on us
Uh,
as long as we drop more. That's kind of
right.
my thought process. But,
I
it
do
may
think
work.
I do think that their top assistant, Kevin Young, he's supposed to be like a great
Yes,
offensive assistant
I'm
coach.
aware.
So
Yeah.
I think the thought process is like, well, we have some offensive oriented assistants that will
Sure.
be able to help, Vogel with his offensive schemes, right? Because he was the coach for the Lakers the year they won the title, and
Right.
he was, a great defensive coach for them, right? But
Absolutely.
obviously their offense, was, not
Shaky.
ideal, for, considering, we've seen other LeBron teams, right, where their offense is, you know, not as rough,
Hmm.
and now obviously it's a different roster, right? Because they didn't have any, guards, that were the same type of guys that he had with previous teams, right? There
Right.
was no Kyrie or Dwayne Wade
Right.
on that championship Lakers team, right? It was like, KCP, Danny Green.
Yeah.
I guess Rondo, you could argue, was quote unquote the closest, but right, he's
Yeah.
a
They're
very
more
different.
like defense. I don't know. It's kind of weird. It's not in that tier, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. So, but either way, um, regardless, I think they're kind of banking on the assistant coach, kind of being the guy that kind of does the offense, and also I guess the players as well, considering those are guys that know how to create shots for themselves.
Right.
So I think that's kind of also where they're looking at it. But you do kind of wonder, like, is it gonna work?
Right.
For sure, because like you said, it does feel like some guys are playing a little out of position because, like you said, I don't feel like Bradley Beal is a point guard.
He's not.
Um,
And it could be a
so
nightmare. Just a heads
yeah,
up to everybody.
like I'm sure he's probably ran like second units,
Yes,
in
absolutely.
Washington, but like that's not his main thing. His
He
main
can
thing is
bring up the
not
ball, but can he
right,
run the one and facilitate, get people open, and also get his own shot off without turning the ball over? I don't think
right.
so.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, so that's kind of how I look at it. So,
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, so I mean, that's pretty much our thoughts, on the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah.
Obviously, anyone if they want to in the comments, can share their thoughts, on what they think, whether or not they agree or disagree, with either of us.
And let us
Um,
know, what team we should do next. Unless we can pick, but if nobody lets us know or nobody says anything in the comments, we'll just pick. But if you guys have a team that we should pick, let us know.
Yeah, exactly. So now obviously we're gonna move on and kind of wrap it up with the the typical news and rumors.
Hmm.
Obviously, nothing, not too much concrete has happened as of yet. Nothing in terms of trades, right? Obviously, we know earlier today, right, with the campaign trade and the Pole Bowl signing, right? We already got into that, so you
Yeah.
can just go back and look at the earlier part, to hear our thoughts on that. But according to Mark Stein, Dallas, they haven't ruled out the potential of a sign and trade with Christian Wood.
Right.
I don't feel like that's gonna happen just
No.
because at this point, like he's still been waiting around in free agency. I don't feel like you normally see a scenario where a guy's just kind of sat there, just kind of
Right.
just waiting. I feel like wherever he goes, it's probably just gonna be either for like one of those small exceptions or like for the
Minimum.
minimum.
Yep.
Um, because again, like his market clearly is dried up. In
It's
terms
sad to
of
see actually because he had a lot of
yeah,
promise.
yeah, in terms of him not getting, what he's wanted. Which is again kind of interesting because again, Dallas traded for him, didn't really give up much to get him, right? So it was kind of a low risk, potentially solid reward. Then when he first got there, it seemed like it worked out relatively well, right? But
Hmm.
then over the course of the season, it just stopped working.
Right.
He was moved to the bench, and then his minutes kind of just dropped off altogether. So you knew he wasn't going to be brought back.
Right.
It just feels kind of bizarre. But again, Dallas is kind of, in a way, like, considering they've added more bigs to their roster, they're clearly, you know, looking, in my opinion, to move on from him. I don't think a sign and trade's going to happen.
Right. I
But I
agree.
could always be wrong.
I agree
Um,
though.
yeah, moving on into the next one, which is somewhat related. Clint Capella, Atlanta's okay with potentially trading him, potentially in a three-team deal where Clint Capella goes to Dallas,
Okay.
um, Pascal Siakam goes from Toronto to Atlanta,
Okay.
and then I guess something from Atlanta or Dallas, goes to Toronto. But
Question.
obviously, yeah,
Didn't Siakam say he didn't want to play for Atlanta or something like that? a while
I
back.
thought I think what was reported was the idea of he's not gonna sign an extension with whomever
Okay,
trades for
that's what
him.
it was. Right. You're right.
I don't think he ever, like, specifically
Right.
mentioned any actual
Right.
teams,
Right. You're right.
but that's what was reported, I think, through Chris Haynes, and obviously that can change, um, based off of, if he actually gets traded. Because
Sure.
again, like, I'm some of it's probably also just, like, negotiations and leverage.
Hmm.
Because I'm sure there are some teams he would prefer to go to versus others, right? Like, I'd imagine if he gets traded, he'd probably prefer to go to a team that has, like, a legitimate chance at doing something as opposed to
Absolutely.
just, him getting traded to, like, NBA Siberia or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Get
so,
exiled
I
to
mean,
the gulag or something.
yeah, exactly. Like so that would be an interesting deal
Yeah.
because again, Dallas, we've talked about them, kind of needing some help in that front court spot with the center.
Yeah.
We know that they acquired some extra centers, right? They got um Rashawn Holmes, drafted Derek Lively. But they still have a couple other guys like, JaVale McGee. At this point, it just feels like he's probably going to be gone at some point. I think Stein thinks he's either going to be, traded or waived or something like that, stretched and waived, I guess, to be more specific.
Hmm.
Um, but what do you think? Like, if that were to actually happen, like, obviously, it's just a framework. It's
Right.
not like obviously the actual trade. Would you like that trade? For all
So
the teams
so
involved?
so run it back. So it was Siakam to Atlanta,
Yeah.
Capella to Dallas, and then what does Toronto
Yeah.
get?
We don't know because that wasn't really suggested.
Okay.
My guess is they're probably getting something like guys like JaVale McGee,
Sure.
uh,
Okay.
like Tim
Well,
Hardaway, like basically like Dallas's expiring
sure.
contracts, if I had to guess.
Well, in that case, I like it for every team, honestly. And I know people are probably scratching their heads like, why would you like it for, Toronto? Well, I think they should probably, engage in somewhat of a full rebuild. So I think that's, a big step in terms of getting rid of, the star player that hasn't necessarily worked out since your title run. And, he wasn't even the number one option. It was really Kawhi. Um, so, I like that for Toronto. You get rid of him. Atlanta, you get a great player in Siakam. And then also, I feel like Siakam brings a little bit more to the table than Capella. Capella's more of like, interior defensive big, which is cool.
And you got
Nothing
to
wrong with that.
move.
Exactly. So, you're fine. And then, if you move Capella to Dallas, that's exactly what you needed. You needed a big defensive guy. So, and I think that's better than Christian Wood at this point. And we don't know what Derek Lively's going to look like, once he gets into the NBA. In the summer league he looked okay. Not really up to the hype in terms of what people were saying scouting wise. I think he looked better in college, but nonetheless, I think Capella is definitely an upgrade at center for Dallas. So I like that for all teams. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for Toronto, again they didn't really mention what they would get. I would hope
Sure.
they would get like something player wise back
Hmm.
more so than just expiring contracts. Just because Siakam's like a a pretty good player, good enough that you'd think he'd get not a star back, obviously, but
Right.
like maybe a decent young player.
Right.
From one of those teams. It's just again the framework was it felt like it was more so like just leaning towards like, what Dallas and Atlanta would want.
I get you.
Whereas like I said, Toronto, I'm assuming is just kind of like uh sort of just like the middleman sort of for the
Yeah, I get
team.
you. Yeah.
But I'm kind of with you where I do like it, for all the teams. Because again, with Atlanta, right, they gave up those picks, for DeJounte Murray. So you kind of have to find a way to put together a really good competitive roster.
Yeah.
Plus, you have Trey Young as well. So there's no real point in having, a guy, in that tier of players where he's really good and, at least not be a competitive team. Like you said, for Toronto, they need to rebuild, and kind of just start over, with mainly their young guys
Hmm.
that are on the roster, like Scotty Barnes, Grady Dick, um, guys like that. And then, like you said, for Dallas, Capella, that's a pretty solid center.
Yeah.
To pair, with Luca and Kyrie. Obviously, offensively pretty limited.
Very.
Um,
He's pretty.
you know,
He can pretty much only catch lobs.
yeah, exactly. So, limited as an offensive player, right? Completely different player from Christian Wood, but obviously brings a lot more defensively.
Yep.
Um, you know, obviously because he's a center, right? He's like, a taller, well, not tall, but like you know what I mean. He's more
I
like
know
a
what you mean.
traditional center.
Yes.
So he's not like a guy, that you would have like in a switchable defense, right? He'd probably be playing like more drop, I guess.
Yeah.
He can block shots, he can definitely rebound, and that's those would be areas that Dallas, needs improvements in. Because
Defense.
again, we know what they need, right? We know they need more size, more rebounding, more defense,
Yep.
to pair with Luca and Kyrie, because those two guys are, not guys that are really going to play a lot of great defense for you. So
Right.
I like it for all three teams. I would, like I said, I'm just curious as to what Toronto would realistically get back. But I'm assuming most of it would be picks related, just because
Yeah.
just because again, like you're probably like if you're Dallas, right? You're not trading either Luca or Kyrie for Siakam.
Absolutely
They're
not.
not trading for Siakam, but you know what I mean. Like, and
Yeah.
they're not giving up like any major guys in the rotation. I would think for Capella, right?
No.
So like,
They'll
so
be
like
good with that. I think
yeah,
that's
exactly.
fine.
Same with Atlanta, right? They're not trading Dejounte Murray or Trey Young for Siakam. Um, so if you're Toronto, right, basically like expiring contracts and draft picks.
Mhm.
I think that
That's what
makes a
you
lot of
want for
sense.
a rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. So I like it. Like I said, for those teams, it's just I don't know if that's what's going to happen because reportedly Dallas had looked at Capella before. It was just I guess they were saying that the price was a little too high.
Okay.
Where they probably would have had to have given up one of their draft picks, which I understand.
Yeah.
Because again, if you can manage to still swing Capella and you keep those young guys, then you'd
You're
rather do
good.
that. Um, so yeah, so I'm good with that.
Me too.
Um, according to Sun Sentinel, right? So
Okay.
I guess I'm assuming that's like the Miami papers or whatever.
Yeah.
Hero's only really been offered for Damon Durant. I mean, I guess sure. I mean, in a way, like though again, like we already know, like Bam and Butler are off the table in any of these
Yep.
trades. So I feel like it's kind of like a no
A
kidding
given.
type
Yeah,
of
it's a given.
yeah, given. Yeah, because like if you're Miami, your team, unless you're like you want to keep Butler and Bam because
Absolutely.
those guys are like the core of your team. So
Yeah.
you're not getting rid of either of those guys for Dame. Um,
Mm-mm.
but so I mean I don't really understand the purpose of it. Like, but I guess it's kind of like almost framing like he's always been in trade rumors. Um, and I guess that means like Miami like views him very highly, where it's like we're only gonna trade him if we get back somebody really really good. But again, like if you're gonna try to improve the roster and get back somebody good, yeah, that's kind of what you have to do anyway. So
Yeah. Like you said, no brainer. I think that 1 + 1 = 2 there.
yeah. According to Woj, right, Nets signed Darius Baisley, right? He was on the Suns previously.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then I guess he was before that he was in Oklahoma City, right? He
Yeah.
was a young guy, right? If I'm not mistaken. Um, I think he was the guy that spent like a year as like a Nike representative, right?
I
Something
believe
like that,
so. Something like
or,
that.
or Foot Locker, one of those companies. Um, he was part of that Oklahoma City rebuild. Once they got rid of Westbrook, I guess started and played a decent amount, but just hasn't really panned out a whole lot.
Yeah.
Again, like the fact that Phoenix just let him go and didn't bring him back, that kind of, makes me question, how effective of a player is he really going to be? But again, with the Nets, they signed a few young guys this offseason, and there's again, that's fine, right? They're a team that's kind of in this weird place where they can't really completely rebuild because they don't have all their picks, but they also, don't really have the talent to be really, really, really good. So, I don't really have a problem with the signing because, again, like we talked about with Bol, and some of these other roster signings that these other teams have made, you're just taking a flyer on a young guy. And if he pops, fine. If he doesn't, it's a minimum contract.
Yeah. I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. He had a lot of promise coming out of high school and stuff. I think he actually skipped college, and I think he went to the G League immediately, I believe. So, I feel like he's just young. Um, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was New Balance. I think it was New
Yeah, New
Balance.
Balance. I
That
think
was
that's what it
it
was.
was the
Thank you.
internship. I think that's
Yeah,
what it
thank
was.
you.
So
Yeah, thank you.
that was pretty cool that he was able to do that. But outside of that, he hadn't really made any noise. But it's only what his this will be his third year, I believe. So
Maybe like fourth or
fourth,
fifth at this point. 'Cause
really? Okay.
yeah, because I think he's been around, for a little bit. Like I said, I think
You're
he was
right.
part of.
He was.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're right.
he
You're
was in
right. So
that
this will be his.
2019 draft. That was the
Yeah.
Zion
So
draft
this will
class.
be
So
his fifth year,
yeah,
sixth maybe. I don't know.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's fifth because he was in that Zion draft class. So I think it's fifth.
Yeah. So I mean, it is what it is. So like I said, I don't really have a problem with Brooklyn doing that, but
Yeah.
he didn't really do anything else.
Yeah, according to Yahoo Sports, Hornets not close on deal with PJ Washington. Kind of interesting, right? Because he was a guy that's played for Charlotte at this point for a while.
Right.
Obviously we know they brought back Miles Bridges on that qualifying offer. So he's gonna miss I think what the first 10ish games, but
Mm-hmm.
PJ Washington still hasn't been signed to anything. So I do kind of wonder what's going on there, right? Because I guess the plan is to give him an extension, but my guess is that PJ Washington probably wants more because we didn't talk about this in the previous podcast. But I think Isaiah Stewart, right? He signed like a 4-year, $64 million
Mm-hmm.
extension to stay with Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Jake Fisher was basically saying that, like, PJ wants a deal similar to that. Which I guess.
I don't like that.
I feel like I like Stewart a little better than PJ
I like
Washington,
him a
but I
lot
don't.
more.
Yeah, yeah, but I also like think he's just okay. You know what I mean? Like I
Right.
don't like I don't have a problem with the Isaiah Stewart contract, right? Because like 4 years, 64. That's a decent amount. That's 16 million a year for a guy that's gonna probably be a backup for them.
Right.
Um,
And a
but either
good
way,
backup, not a bad one either.
yeah. So I guess the question is PJ Washington worth 16 million a year? I mean,
No.
clearly Charlotte doesn't think so.
And if they
So
don't, then that's a problem. So I don't
yeah,
think
so
I don't think no.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So reportedly he might sign his $8.5 million qualifying offer. So basically, if he's on the qualifying offer, that's always a gamble because it's basically, after that you're an unrestricted free agent. So if you pan out really well, then you could make a lot of money and you don't necessarily have to stick with the team that drafted you because you're
Right.
unrestricted. If it doesn't work, right, then your market might be, in some big trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you'll be a free agent and not a restricted one, so the team doesn't have to bring you back if they don't want to.
Right.
So it's a gamble for him. Maybe that's ultimately what he does because I just don't see Charlotte giving him like 16 million a year.
Me
They've
neither.
typically been kind of like really weird with their contracts. They did overpay a number of other guys like Batum,
Oh
um,
gosh, don't remind me of that.
yeah, Batum, Gordon Hayward. And yeah, I guess naturally they kind of have to, just in order to get those type of guys, because you're not normally going to get big time guys to come to Charlotte.
Sure.
Um, but at the same time, I don't know, right? It's new ownership. I don't know how they're going to handle, this situation. So I don't know. It wouldn't shock me if he took the qualifying offer, but it also wouldn't shock me if they came to like some type of mutual agreement that's maybe not as much as Isaiah Stewart's, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe somewhere in the ballpark.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure at this point.
It's not off the table, I don't think. I
Yeah,
just
because I feel
personally
like
wouldn't do it.
he's good enough where like if you're Charlotte, like you're probably not going to get somebody better if
Sure.
um than what you have. But I also understand like, is he really like good enough where it's like 64 million 4 years like because that's a lot, kind of like the Struess contract, right? Like he's gotten like 4 years, 64 million and it's like if he's making like 10 million a year, that's awesome. That's
Right.
fine, right? But then it's like, you know, 16 million a year, right? That's getting in the ballpark of he's probably going to have to play a lot every game and, maybe potentially close.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, I don't know. So,
It's a
because
lot of
again,
money.
I feel like he's a fine player.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't know. Like I said, I don't have a problem if they decided to extend him. I don't know if what his, agreement is, what
Right.
he
But
wants.
his number
Obviously, he
is.
wants that. Obviously, he wants that full amount. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
I should have said I don't know what Charlotte wants. Clearly
Right.
less, but how much less I don't know, right? Because we saw D'Lo and the Lakers eventually come to agreements, right? Because we thought, initially like the amount that he got, we thought he was going to get more. I thought he was going to get like between 20 to 25.
You
I
guys
think
got
you
him on
thought
a
he would get
budget,
like,
man.
yeah, I think you thought he would get around 25.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I never thought he was going to get 30 like he
Absolutely
was
not.
before, just because of how the playoffs went. But
Yeah.
obviously with Charlotte, we haven't
Yeah.
seen them in the playoffs, so we'll just have to see.
Yeah.
Um, More stuff. Brian Windhorst, multiple groups eyeing Vegas. Obviously, we've known for a while, right, that clearly the NBA wants to expand. They're looking at adding some more teams. We know Vegas is going to be one of the first ones if they get it. Maybe Seattle's another one. Again, no issues with that whatsoever because again, we
Yeah.
knew it was coming. Obviously, once it comes, it'll be interesting to see what they do in terms of like moving the teams around because it's been suggested that they will probably move a couple of those West Coast teams to the East, which makes a lot of sense, right? So my guess is like probably one of them is probably Memphis, where they'll move to the East, which again makes sense because nobody would ever say Memphis is a West Coast
Yeah.
city.
They're literally
Uh,
like right almost around Florida. So it's like, okay.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like I think the state of Tennessee borders, my state. So I mean, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And this is not the West Coast. So,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, so I guess the other team maybe New Orleans, because again, that's not
It's
West Coast
not
either.
West, no.
Um, So we'll have to see. But either way, that'd be kind of interesting, to see a team in Vegas. Obviously, we just came back from Vegas.
Yeah.
If you hadn't seen, our in-person episode of, as well as our vlog.
Yeah, check those
So
out.
it'll be, yeah, exactly. And they have a new arena, so it'll be interesting to see, an NBA team play there just because, Vegas now has more sports, that are coming there, right? They
Yeah,
had the football team go there a few years back.
Raiders. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. They have, the Las Vegas Aces for WNBA.
The
And
Knights
then
for
yeah,
hockey.
Knights.
I think
Yeah,
it's
and
the
I think
Knights.
Oakland A's, they're going to be coming to
Yeah.
Vegas, the baseball team. So yeah, it only makes sense, I think, for an NBA team to come there at some point.
Yeah, I agree. And no issues with that for me.
Yeah. And then last, but not least, another trade rumor. So maybe this one should have been second to last, but regardless, according to the Athletic, um, we had another potential Dallas trade that could have happened but didn't
Okay.
happen. Dallas and Detroit engaged in a Bogdanovich trade where it would have been Boyan and Killian Hayes, your
Oh
guy to
boy.
Dallas, for probably JaVale McGee and Tim Hardaway Jr., but it didn't happen. I guess
Okay.
there was also questions about maybe some draft compensation. This was, I think, talked about, I guess, before the I'm assuming before the draft, but it just never happened.
Okay.
What do you think? What do you think about that trade if it had happened? Would you have liked it?
I actually would have liked that. It would have been cool to see Killian Hayes get a change of scenery. I think that's what he needs. The guard room in Detroit, I think, is a little bit over competitive for him at this point. Think he needs to go somewhere else and find a completely different role outside of that locker room. And for I think it was what Boyan. I don't have an issue with that. I think it's something that they could potentially use. I mean, he's not one of the stronger defenders, but it would also be nice to hear finally squash the rumors with him because feel like he's been in rumors, ever since we started this podcast. Um,
Right.
and I think Dallas would be an interesting fit. They don't necessarily need the scoring, but um, I don't think it would hurt them if they, were able to find a way to get that deal done.
Right.
And then what you said, Detroit would get JaVale McGee and Tim Hardaway.
Yeah. So
I
like
mean,
basically expired contracts and what would have probably been draft
I
compensation.
mean, I like the Hardaway thing, but I don't really like the McGee thing because I feel like they've got a decent crop of centers in Detroit. I think
Right.
it's what Marvin Bagley, James
Yep.
Wiseman, Duren,
Dirt.
and what was the last one? Stewart. Yeah, Stewart. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's four solid big men that you can't really go wrong with. I mean, maybe you went wrong with Wiseman, but outside of those, I feel like you're doing a good job. So there's no point in
Probably would
adding
have.
McGee. Yeah, they
They
probably
probably
would
would
have cut
have
him,
made
but
more.
hey, man, I mean, it is what it is, but I think I like that more from Dallas's perspective than Detroit's. But I mean, if it would have happened, cool. But since it didn't, oh well. I mean, I'm not up in the rafters about that trade not happening. If you get what I'm saying.
So obviously for our last piece of news, if you hadn't heard, LeBron, he's going to change his jersey number from 6 back to 23. His original LA number, I guess. So basically, if you hadn't heard, a lot of the big reason for this was, obviously, if you weren't aware, Bill Russell passed away last year. 11-time champion NBA legend. And so because of that, initially they were kind of allowing for, I guess, a lot of people who wore the number 6. They were kind of grandfathered in and they were able to wear it to finish out the season.
Right.
But I guess a lot of those guys now are going to change their numbers because the NBA has retired his jersey number. So he's going back to number 23. So obviously, if you have his number 23 jersey, you can bring it out again.
Yeah.
It's gonna be accurate, which I do have one of those, so that'll be nice.
Rep it,
Um,
man.
yeah, but it is kind of funny, right? Just because again, he technically has two numbers with LA, and you do kind of wonder if they end up retiring both. Obviously they're going to retire, one of his numbers. I'm
Mhm.
assuming just because he already won a title with them.
Right.
But it is kind of interesting, just because again, like his initial plan. I think I thought their initial plan was like 80 was going to switch back to whatever his previous number was. I guess what was it like 23 or whatever, and then
Yeah.
LeBron 6. But now LeBron can't wear 6. So I'm assuming they're just going to keep the numbers that they have now. So
Right.
just kind of an interesting thing. And honestly, something that I'd kind of forgotten about,
Same.
just in terms of the jersey thing. But it makes sense, obviously, because again, they did officially retire Bill Russell's number.
Hmm.
So and again, it makes sense. I do kind of wonder if there will ever be any other guys' numbers that they'll retire. Like, obviously it's kind of a morbid subject, but like, let's say, like, would they retire like Michael Jordan's jersey number or, somebody else like that? But either way, just kind of a thing that had been recently reported. So obviously it makes sense to cover it.
Yeah. I agree, and I think it's the right move. And it's pretty cool, that LeBron is able to, switch back to 23, and that's a pretty historic number, um, NBA wise, and just basketball wise in general. I mean, who doesn't want to wear number 23, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I guess aside from, people who wear a number that's not 23.
Sure. But at the end of
Yeah,
the day,
but
it's all in the back of our heads. We all want to be like Mike.
um well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Again, as we had mentioned before, if you hadn't already seen it, we have our vlog, of our time that was spent in Las Vegas. It was fun. It was awesome.
Yes.
So check it out if you haven't already. In addition to the podcast that we did together in person while we were in Vegas. So again, don't forget to like and subscribe. We appreciate the growing amount of subscribers. On the road to 50 subscribers, which we're getting closer and closer
Yeah.
to. I believe we're about 12, 13 subscribers away
Mm-hmm.
as of this recording. So, hopefully everybody can, contribute and keep for allowing that to grow. So, hopefully everybody, has, a great Monday, and then we'll see you at the end of the week.